Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we're talking about the ongoing controversy over Ilhan Omar and the sort of racist, murderous Islamophobia on the right. A little bit of background here. So, a couple weeks ago, Omar was giving a speech at this. I'm not exactly sure what it was.
The Council of American Islamic Relations.
Yeah, it was. I think it was maybe sponsored by them, but some event basically just sort of Muslim activism. And one of the whole point of the speech, as we'll talk about later, was to sort of argue that Muslims should assert their rights as American citizens, to say that we're a part of this community and we're not going to sort of keep our heads down and be subjected to collective guilt for acts of terrorism. And the sort of money quote that got passed around a lot in the media is, she said, here's the truth. Far too long we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen, and frankly I'm tired of it, and every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. CARE, that's what you're talking about earlier, was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and then all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. So very clear, indeed, totally anodyne argument as to why bigotry is bad.
Yes.
This is why, you could sort of turn it on its head and say, like, well, the Christchurch mosque shooter was a white man, and the Timothy McVeigh was a white man, and the Sandy Hook shooter was a white man, and so therefore all white men should bear collective responsibility.
Ryan, when some people do something, that doesn't mean that we're all responsible for it. It's just some people doing it, and we don't need to act like we're also terrorists, okay?
Yeah, and basically the right seized on those words, some people did something, and they used it basically to reinforce the collective guilt of all Muslims for 9/11. Dan Crenshaw, the one-eyed representative from Texas, who used to be a Navy SEAL, he tweeted, first member of Congress ever to describe terrorists who killed thousands of Americans on 9/11 as some people did something. The New York Post, probably that's the worst really big-time mainstream thing I've seen. They had a front page headline which said, quoted that, and then it had just a picture of 9/11, and here's your something, 2,977 people dead by terrorism. Your something. Right,
right.
And the message of it is not at all subtle, and Laura Loomer, the crackpot right winger on Instagram, she's accused Omar of treason. She said that, quote, Islam is a cancer on humanity and Muslims should not be allowed to seek positions of political office in this country. And so,
Well, and the most charitable interpretation is that people were offended because the right translated some people did something as minimizing 9/11, right? It's just something that some people did, as if like it's taking out the trash, like just something happened that's like, just quotidian and just not worthy of note. And so like the most charitable interpretation is that the offense, whether or not it was bigoted about blaming Muslims writ large, was this also totally incorrect, taken out of context understanding of her quote as something that it wasn't, right?
Yeah. I mean, the in the context, she's talking about Muslims, and then later on, she goes on to talk about how on the other hand, you shouldn't be just automatically sympathetic of countries just because, the population and the leadership are Muslims. You should say, if those countries, like Egypt or something, are doing bad things, and we should criticize them. We shouldn't hesitate. So it's not it's the most just sort of anodyne type of thing that even George Bush said after 9/11, that we can't blame all Muslims for this. There's 1.8 billion of them. This is a bunch of radical extremists, and it is, I think it is the clear biggest danger of terrorism in this country right now. Maybe wasn't always this way, but is right-wing white nationalists, neo-Nazis, that sort of political, like that sort of violent extremism.
Yeah,
and I think it's functionally identical to how Islamist terrorism works. You have a tiny fraction of absolutely dingbat radicals who think that killing lots of civilians is a way to achieve their objective. And some of them say, we should crash planes into buildings, or we should do suicide bombings, and others, and then the other side, they say that we should go into a mosque and shoot, dozens of innocent people, or go into a synagogue and shoot dozens of innocent people. And that's how we need to achieve our political objectives. And in neither case should you blame the entire demographic category that they happen to belong to for what's going on. But it's beyond obvious. It all came to a head when Trump tweeted out a video that was, made up of the, Omar comments superimposed over images of 9/11, and just trying to whip up a frenzy of hatred against her. And so then there was a big backlash over, over Trump, but then also, the refusal of the Democratic leadership to protect her, stand up for her, because, previously, when she got in hot water over some ill-phrased comments about the influence of Israel, they put up they did put together a vote to condemn her, and they at AIPAC, Chuck Schumer compared her to neo-Nazis as saying on the one hand, when Trump says that there are very fine people at Charlottesville, we have to call that out. And on the other hand, when Omar says this or that, we have to call that out, as if there are identical behaviors.
That smells like false equivalence to me, my friend.
Yeah. And, so Bernie Sanders, as should not be surprising, he was first out of the gate to say that this was terrible. Elizabeth Warren was not far behind him. Then there were a variety, quite a bit later than that. Pete Buttigieg had a thing about how he was in Afghanistan. Nancy Pelosi said in a tweet, quote, "The memory of 9/11 is sacred ground, and any discussion of it must be done with reverence. The president shouldn't use the painful images of 9/11 for a political attack." So that one, she's
just gutless.
She's accepting the criticism that Omar somehow downplayed 9/11. And Christian Gillibrand did the same thing. She said, quote, "As a senator who represents 9/11 victims, I can't accept any minimizing of that pain. But Trump's dangerous rhetoric against Ilhan Omar is disgusting. It's a false choice to suggest we can't fight terrorism and reject Islamophobic hate at once. A president should do both." And so, she's sort of setting it up with a kind of backhanded swipe at Omar, which accepts the right-wing false frame of this as if, Omar is just sort of shrugging off 9/11. No big deal. It was, not a problem. And so, this then,
don't forget what Pelosi did next, right? Going over across the pond and meeting with defectors from the Labor Party because they thought that Corbyn is anti-Semitic, and they're polling at 1%, but she thought it'd be important at this time amidst this PR maelstrom to meet with those idiots.
I think that's instructive, because I've sort of paid half a year's worth of attention to the whole Corbyn controversy. And I think the case that he's anti-Semitic and the case that Ilhan Omar is anti-Semitic are pretty much equally valid, which is to say 99% invalid. So Omar, as many Jews have said, is like her comments back in March when she originally got in hot water were kind of ill-phrased. It's like you don't want to, right? Yeah, a little bit tone deaf. Like she clearly wasn't. She wasn't familiar with how you phrase the thing she's trying to say, in a way that's sensitive to the I think totally legitimate concerns about enabling anti-Semitism and so on. And similarly with Corbyn, and like some of his history, there's that mural and so on. But I don't think in either case, no sympathetic observer would look at that and be like, yeah, these people are dedicated anti-Semites. Like they just don't care about it at all. It's like a thing where they're not, they come from a sort of radical tradition where the how anti-Semitism has been leveraged, the anti-Semitism has been leveraged to shut down any criticism of Israel has been taken for a given, because that absolutely does happen all the time. And the evidence of that was no clearer than later when after the whole Omar thing, Trump went in front of the Republican Jewish coalition. And so, the criticism about Omar is she's sort of like dancing next to tropes about dual loyalty, right? So that like Jews have dual loyalty to Israel and America. Trump straight up said that he referred to Netanyahu as your prime minister.
Speaking to Americans.
Speaking to American Jews. Yeah. And the conservatives who had been shitting their pants completely off their legs about Omar's comments did not say a single fucking word about this.
Well, similarly, Trump actually is on audio, at least, I don't know about video. I think it actually is video. In the wake of 9/11, talking about how his building is now the tallest in New York City because the World Trade Center used to be the tallest and now his wins. Like, such a sociopath that he literally was using 9/11 to talk about how he's the greatest. He's got the tallest building now. And so once again, there's like, I feel like we're in the upside down or something. Like Trump actually embodies the very thing he's using to attack people, which then the Democrats like glob onto to mischaracterize and attack people from their own party. This is so endemic of what our problem nationally, politically is, right?
Yeah. I mean, Trump is an anti-Semite. I think that's absolutely unquestionable. He supports Israel. And you see Netanyahu jumping on board for him with the same reason that he jumps on board with fucking Viktor Orban or right-wing Polish politicians who downplay Poland's role in the Holocaust, because that it fits with his sort of nationalist project to scoop all the Jews into Israel, and also find some international support given that most of the liberal democracies think he's dog shit, but
right. But he's not a patriot in any meaningful sense, actually, right? So and neither is Netanyahu, and we can talk about this in a little bit about how actually Omar is much more, insofar as patriotism could be something of a virtue in any way, she represents it far more than Trump, right? And so it's kind of interesting to think about things that are not patriotism insofar as it could be a virtue, like jingoism or a type of nationalism project that you were referring to, and to actually sort the wheat from the chaff and see that, the people that are being attacked actually are the best America has to offer, and the people that are appropriating the flag tend to be the most cynical bastards who have actually no real care or kind of reverence for what it might mean to keep our polity functioning in a healthy way.
Yeah. We'll return to the Democrats in a minute, but I think Israel is a good example of how this process tends to eat itself. That Israel has boasted for decades that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. I would say Iran is about as democratic as Israel is, especially if you include the Palestinians that are under occupation. But nevertheless, right, Jews at least and Arab Israelis do have the right to vote. But as this fanatical right-wing nationalism has taken hold in Israel, Jewish democracy has been eroded, even for Jews in Israel, to the extent where, there's just enormous hatred of leftists and for, sort of just gradual suppression of left-wing parties, and a reduction of general political rights, where like you travel abroad and you say the wrong thing, you criticize Netanyahu, you might not be able to get back into the country. You're going to be subjected to, these intrusive screenings and so on. And Netanyahu himself, by all accounts, is reportedly insanely corrupt. He has been on the take, directing money to himself and to his political allies and friends, undermining sort of clean government. This practically always goes hand in hand with this kind of extreme right-wing politics. That's right. And it goes to show you that like it's a false chalice. It's like it gives a sort of a psychological balm to people who are afraid of outsiders and whatnot. But what it ends up doing is making the place just enormously shitty place to live, where your freedom of speech is very seriously circumscribed, and you're subject to constant surveillance and unaccountable, police agencies. Many U.S. citizens have been caught up in Trump's anti-immigrant dragnet, not even all of them Mexican, I don't believe.
But no, Ryan, there are at least, according to Trump and Fox News, 3 Mexican countries. So they might be from one of those 3 Mexican countries.
I should say Mexican descent, not from Mexico. But it's just a fucking they set concentration camps up and people get sucked in, So at any rate, it's just like it goes to show you, I would say, that it's just a rancid way of organizing a society, and it's a way that it turns outward worse. Like the people subjected to the Muslim ban and the refugee caravan fear mongering and so on, or whatever wars Trump might start, have it much worse. But it turns into the interior as well. The search for scapegoats is kind of omnidirectional.
Yeah. It's. I mean, we've talked about the psychology of it before, and the ways in which, the ancient Greek notion of spiritedness or thumos is. It's important to align that with the other parts of the soul, as it were. Reason and your appetites. But Trumpism is the kind of he's the type of petty tyrant who his own soul is disordered and tyrannical and totally misaligned in a way that makes his kind of spiritedness and appetites just whip up the kinds of emotions in people that get them to ignore the facts on the ground, right? That pertain to their well-being, that pertain to where the location of the actual problems are, to the fact that like a few thousand asylum seekers and migrants has absolutely nothing to do with whether they can pay the bills. But what it does do is does satisfy that kind of emotional craving to somehow cope with the meaninglessness that capitalism otherwise provides people on a day-to-day basis, right? So there is a reason that infotainment and Fox News is kind of an addictive form of entertainment and catharsis for the otherwise less than fulfilled. And having the opportunity to scapegoat a member of Congress, a woman of color who is a lefty, and to align her with Muslims writ large and 9/11 is a great opportunity to, again, bypass the reason in the soul of his supporters and get them to just relish the projection of their undealt with problems in life onto an enemy that they could then attack and own the libs by pissing the libs off at the same time. So it's just one of many instances where facts don't matter, political economic realities don't matter. What matters is, as we've talked about with the Adorno episode, Trump's psychological relationship with his fans, where they can love how he's so narcissistically telling them they're right and their identity, and at the same time, and related to that, telling them who's wrong and who they could be mad at for the state of their unhappiness.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say, as a sort of counter perspective, there's a pretty good piece by Peter Beinart in the Atlantic, which gets into this, what we were speaking about previously, the value of religious freedom for all religious minorities. He says. He watched a speech and he says, "What I found was unexpected. In offering a vision for how to live as an American Muslim, her speech to CARE beautifully evoked what I treasure about being an American Jew. Omar's core argument was simple. We Muslims are not guests here. We are as American as everyone else, and thus we should bring our full selves into the public square." And so, if you're thinking about a sort of universalist, egalitarian type of moral framework, and you're Jewish, well, then the ability of Muslims to practice their faith and to participate fully in the political community is directly relevant to your freedom. They're all bound up in each other because, as that famous poem goes, first they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist, but that process tends to keep going, and until all the minorities are gone.
Yeah. No, that's right. And
maybe as a closing comment here, back to the Democrats. For a long time we've heard all this stuff about party unity, about how Bernie should be inside the tent pissing out type of thing. He shouldn't criticize Democrats for doing this or that, but you just see in this case it really explicitly that it is just an utterly opportunistic perspective. It couldn't be more obvious that Pelosi, and especially Chuck Schumer, who is, I would say, a very racist against Palestinians and Muslims, that they just don't, they don't care that much about Omar. He did criticize Trump's tweet after the weekend, and everyone's screaming at him online. But, from his comments at AIPAC, they just don't want these. They don't want the, women of color from marginalized communities, who have been supposedly the backbone of the Democratic Party for the last decade, black women of color and so on. They can participate in the Democratic Party insofar as they don't make any sort of radical demands.
Yeah, in fact,
and they don't get themselves into trouble.
Yeah.
If the Democrats had done something with Omar where they're like, look, we're going to set up some sort of sensitivity training or something to make sure you don't step into these potholes,
Right.
We're going to train you up so that you can express your criticism of American foreign policy in a sensible way that's rhetorically, nobody would have said anything.
Get in line. They would discipline and punish them. They need to get in line. I mean, this is a number of times since this new wave and new class of Congress people have come in. Remember when AOC was criticizing the fact that their orientation was being sponsored by these businesses at Harvard, and just totally in bed with big business. she was criticized for not knowing how things work, and she'll basically have to figure it out the hard way, or some really dismissive comment about how she better understand that, like, basically everyone's bought and sold, and if you don't just get in line with that, you're going to be. And Pelosi dismissively of this whole wing of the party and all the new people they're bringing into politics on 60 Minutes, I think just this past Sunday, said when she was asked about the movement within the Democratic Party and the rising left wing, she dismissively says, that's like 5 people.
Yeah.
Which is just incredible when 70% of the country is in favor of Medicare for all. When Joe Crowley, the third in line to be speaker, 10-term, right, congressman, was just trounced by AOC. Yeah, no real popular support there, right? Just a fluke. These people don't. I mean, they have to rationalize it that way because they don't want to change. The point is, and we'll have to have Rich Yesselson back on because we didn't get to address, him discussing who the real enemy is, or if we should totally just focus on the Republicans and not have these internecine battles necessarily. Which, I don't think that there has to be an either or, and he even intimated that it's both. But there's definitely a complicity with the Democrats and the Republicans in maintaining the status quo, politically and economically. That's just the way it works. And this is just another lesson in that.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's it's just like Bill Clinton in 1992 or whenever that was, the Sister Souljah moment. When it was convenient for him to throw a leftist black woman under the bus to perform white identity politics for racists. He did it, and it worked out well for him in that instance. And then in this case, it's like at her moment of, very serious vulnerability to physical danger, guy was arrested for calling Omar's office and threatening to kill her. Remarkably, he gave his name and phone number in the process, and so the FBI went to interview him, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm a Trump supporter. I'm a patriot. I don't like radical Muslims in Congress." They're just not going to do anything. If people yell at them for hours, sort of grudgingly be like, "Yes, Trump should stop whipping up genocidal hatred. That's bad." It's just totally one-sided. The leadership wants, unswerving loyalty from these new freshmen who are supposed to be the vanguard of the next generation of Democrats. But if they ever need their help, it's going to be haltingly forthcoming at best. And I think that's just something you got to keep in mind, going forward, because, with this generation of leadership, especially Chuck Schumer, they just don't give a fuck.
No, they have no principle. It's almost cliche to say, but these bastards are just about their own power, and they've rationalized away the actions that actually harm people and serve to entrench the status quo in the face of climate change, tremendous growing inequality, and all kinds of suffering that Trump and just the status quo is bringing to bear on populations of people. They don't really give a shit, and these young upstart leftists do. And instead of getting in line with them and seeing that they're the future of the party and actually that fighting for the integrity of this cause to face these existential crises with vigor and, resolve and integrity and intelligence, the way that AOC and, Tlaib and Omar and others have done, it's just... doesn't this remind you so much of MLK being most frustrated with the white moderate more than the KKK,
yep.
Right? This is the perfect example of how he says, what, I get the KKK. They hate me and we're opposed. But what I really don't get is the white moderate, right? And that just is the perfect way to characterize these assholes.
Yeah, they're most frustrated by inconvenience. It's like, I don't want to try to impeach Trump because it's not going to work. Like, of course it's not going to fucking work. He could bite a baby's heads off in the middle of Times Square and Republican senators would not vote to impeach him.
No, and he said he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue. He said it, and nobody, none of his fans would care. They'd like him all the more. And this is the type, right, of rhetoric that you are complicit with and saying, well, I guess he had a point about what she said about 9/11, but both sides.
Yeah.
And which is why, so what then, to turn maybe to the theory that we read for today, how to think through both Trump, the Dems, and the leftists, and proper understandings of patriotism or what it means to use that language, if there's such a thing, right, as... Because to say maybe that Trump and others misuse the flag is to suggest that there might be a proper way to relate to some type of patriotism, right? And so I think that's an interesting theoretical thing to think about, because I would posit at the outset that what Omar was doing was trying to navigate a proper relationship to what it means to be an American in a healthy way. And so
yes,
that if that's the case, what's the distinction? I think that's worth exploring, right?
Yeah, so we read an article or a lecture called "Is Patriotism a Virtue?" by Alasdair MacIntyre.
Yes.
Who was the W. Elton Jones Professor of Philosophy, Vanderbilt University. And so this was a Lindley lecture at the University of Kansas in March 26, 1984. I don't know if I don't know anything about that person. Do you?
I do. He is a really interesting philosopher. He's still alive. He's pretty old.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was born in 1929. So you did the math on how old he is. But he's quite renowned in moral philosophy, the history of philosophy, and theology. He was at one point a Marxist, then he became a Thomist, Thomas Aquinas. I think he's Catholic, right? And he spent some time at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he's there now, where he is now. Maybe he's still at Vanderbilt, or I'm not sure precisely. But his most famous work is After Virtue. And a number of things he's done refer to kind of the modern or maybe postmodern problems that have been born of not remembering the history of ideas in a way. So for example, and just very briefly, liberalism, as we've talked about before, tends to think of itself as ahistorical and objective and neutral, and kind of almost like a science where you just, there's facts over here, there's values over here, and this is just it's like the Ezra Klein philosophy, right? It's like a non-ideological way to look at the world, and so he sees that itself comes from a liberal tradition. Yeah, and it's especially problematic because it's a tradition that pretends it's not a tradition. So he understands that real disagreements come from different traditions in which people have certain premises about what the good life is, right? And these all arose historically at certain times with certain thinkers, certain ways of life. And in those communities, in those time periods, there was perfectly rational ways to figure out what good and bad were, but they were like delimited by all those assumptions and premises. And so over time, what happened is we kind of lost track of what those rival communities and ways of making sense of the world were. And people just started like thinking that whatever their preference was moral just because it was their preference, and lost track of the fact that they were disagreeing because they had different rival communities and traditions of thoughts that they were like subconsciously appropriating to make their political or moral arguments. And so there's all this disagreement without the people realizing why they're talking past each other. And so he's been very good at kind of offering this model of pluralism in a way that seeks to at least clarify where the disagreements come from and what the different rival premises are. Because within those distinct ways of thinking of the world, they're perfectly rational, logical ways of thinking. It's just very, very different premises, right? So he's been very useful in outlining some of those things.
Yeah, and I would say, just first off, it's just a delightful article. It's very clear, very well reasoned. It's nice to see just a very, very intelligent person just sort of like reading this like incredibly clear and logical argument.
Yeah, no bullshit.
A lot
no
of
bullshit.
philosophy. Yeah. A lot of philosophy is, I think, just like deliberately or maybe semi-consciously written like absolute garbage, just difficulty for the sake of difficulty. But this one is just very, boom, boom, boom. And it's challenging, I would say. And I'm not sure I have an answer to the question he's posing.
Right. Yeah. So we'll link to it. So I don't know if we mentioned the title. Is patriotism a virtue is the question.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. That's what I get for just ignoring half of what you say. Right. So I mean, this, I would think, fits into the broader project I was describing that he tackles, taking the problem of patriotism and the question of patriotism as an example of how there are these different ways of thinking about what a virtue and a vice would be. Specifically, the kind that says in liberal traditions that to be moral is to be disconnected, detached from any particular passions, interests, communities. It's like a universal, this is where universal human rights comes from. It's like this Kantian notion that you kind of abstract from yourself to find out what the universal moral law should be. And so morality is the enlightenment that comes from the freedom to be a rational person detached from any particularity, right? Because that would simply, as Rawls might suggest as well, would be to prefer the position in the world that you're in and try to rationalize why that's better because it benefits you. It's really just about your own power and aggrandizement. But to be truly moral is to kind of, in Rawls is a type of neo-Kantian, to put on the veil of ignorance and pretend that you don't know if you'd be male, female, rich, poor, or whatever, and that would be a more fair way of establishing kind of, what might look moral, because it would be, again, something that applies without respect to any particular advantages you might have in a place or time, right? So there's that notion of morality. That's one notion that tends to be used when we think about patriotism and critiques of it. And then, of course, the definition of patriotism, right, which has a lot to do with, obviously, a particular nation state and a reason to be loyal to that place. And I think he's interesting in how he parses what patriotism is versus other forms that are adjacent to but not quite patriotism, right? So maybe we could just dive into some of this.
Yeah, he says about the case for patriotism. He says, quote, "It is also and correlatively that the goods by reference to which and for the sake of which any set of rules must be justified are also going to be goods that are socially specific and particular. For central to those goods is the enjoyment of one particular kind of social life, lived out through a particular set of social relationships, and thus what I enjoy is the good of this particular social life inhabited by me, and I enjoy it as what it is. It may well be that it follows that I would enjoy and benefit equally from similar forms of social life in other communities. But this hypothetical truth in no way diminishes the importance of the contention that my goods are, as a matter of fact, found among these particular people in these particular relationships. Goods are never encountered except as thus particularized." And so skipping on a bit, he says, "The case for treating patriotism as a virtue is now clear. If, first of all, it is the case that I can only apprehend the rules of morality in the version in which they are incarnated in some specific community, And if secondly, it is the case that the justification of morality must be in terms of particular goods enjoyed within the life of particular communities. And thirdly, it is the case that I am characteristically brought into being and maintained as a moral agent only through the particular kinds of moral sustenance afforded by my community, then it is clear that if that deprived of this community, I am unlikely to flourish as a moral agent. Hence my allegiance to the community and what it requires of me, even to the point of requiring me to die to sustain its life, could not be meaningfully contrasted with or counterposed to what morality required of me.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And yeah,
should we
and maybe just to quote his he says there's a response here though that we can just to get him on the record. He says in terms of abstract universal non-contingent morality, he says, quote, "The liberal answer is clear. Such abstraction and detachment is defensible because it is a necessary condition of moral freedom, of emancipation from the bondage of the social, political, and economic status quo. For unless I can stand back from every and any feature of that status quo, including the roles within it which I myself presently inhabit, I will be unable to view it critically and to decide for myself what stance it is rational and right for me to adopt towards it."
Right.
And I think that the tricky thing about this is like you can really see both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's where he lands. It's really difficult to just think like, well, I think the people who are kind of glib about this sort of thing would be like, well, it's clearly, you have to, be loyal to your family first or whatever. Or there's others who say like, America's dog shit. Everything we do is terrible and you should never have any loyalty to our institutions. But it's really not obvious where you should go with that.
Well, no, because, and so I think we're far more likely with our listeners to find people who are America's dog shit, right, perspective. And and so historically, and we've talked about this before, obviously there's plenty of evidence for that and plenty of reasons to think of the United States of America that way. The problem is if you're a radical or a lefty who is trying to have a vision of and to enact a good life for everyone collectively, it's going to happen here where we live together with the people here. And so like what that means is what the country needs to be will be a different version of American that we think it should be. So that means we are necessarily in a project of redeeming whatever it is we've been into something that we want it to be, which means we have some allegiance to the project of making this country, which is where we are, right? Something good, a community and a number of communities in which people can flourish. So to just totally shit on that as a project means you don't really give a shit, right, about having a good life with the people here at all. One might say.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there is so much to point at in American history that is just absolutely horrible. It's like we stole half of Mexico, we exterminated the Indians. We're running, Marines invading Haiti for like 20 years to protect the sugar company, banana republics, all these quote unquote anti-communist dictatorships that we propped up. And
still to this day, not just historically, mass incarceration.
Oh yeah.
All kinds of, so it's a continual
fucking Yemen.
Yeah. It's a continual process of failure, right, to properly allow huge amounts of populations to flourish and individual injustices that are separate even from those, group injustices and all kinds of terrible things. So that's all true.
But it's not the whole story. There have been instances in which justice has been extended to, marginalized communities. It's like, well, we interned Japanese American citizens during World War II, but those people got reparations later. They weren't exterminated as they would have been in, a truly fascist country. you can point to a lot of just appalling foreign policy atrocities. But on the other hand, under the post-World War II sort of America-dominated economic order, we have allowed a lot of other countries to flourish and become wealthy. In Europe and in Japan and Korea, China is coming up now, and that so it's not as like the thing that I think people miss in terms of viewing the United States as some kind of uniquely evil country is that history is much worse than what America has done. And it's not just a purely 100% exploitation and murder and just subjugating everything except for ourselves. There has been these cracks and these circumstances by which, we have learned to live with, for example, the UK. We used to be our bitterest enemy. And now it's like an important trading partner. And so, could you imagine? And
now we collaborate with them to bomb brown people. Sorry, that's just.
Yes, and then right, and then there's the flip side. We're doing the domination on these other countries, and that is awful and terrible. But I think the question is, how do we treat the global South, in the same way that we treat Western Europe? To say it's like. Norway, it's like the way sort of really far left radicals that you talk about, like how socialist countries are never allowed to exist because they'll just be exterminated by capitalists. But like, Norway owns like 1.3% of all the equities in the world. They just bought those up. And nobody did anything because Norway is embedded in the whole, Western liberal trade relationships and so on, and they're sort of playing by the rules and such. And they have, I would say, the most socialist society that has ever existed. And
what about
nobody? Nobody
Cuba?
even really knows about that.
Cuba.
What's
what
that?
About Cuba?
Cuba doesn't own that much.
Yeah.
And it's not socialist in the sense that it's a dictatorship. I would say, that kind of command oppressive system
goes against the tenets.
Cuba has much to it's the infant mortality rate is lower in Cuba than is in the United States,
Yep.
But it's not as bad as some places. It's certainly not like Stalinist Russia, but they have achieved, I think, like maybe 2/3 of the sort of Marxist utopian dream of collectively controlling the whole economic system. And, we're not sending gunboats over there or anything like that. Barely even notice it's happening. And I would say that should be the project we are Americans, and there's no getting around that. And our task as leftists, I would say, is to try to transform, to reconcile. This is the most interesting part of the essay, I think, that he says, towards the end, he says, for while the liberal moralist was able to conclude that patriotism is a permanent source of moral danger because of the way it places our ties to the nation beyond rational criticism, the moralist who defends patriotism is able to conclude that liberal morality is a permanent source of moral danger because of the way it renders our social and moral ties too open to dissolution by rational criticism. And each party is, in fact, in the right against the other. And he doesn't suggest a sort of, he kind of like points towards a sort of synthesis or a way to get through that. But I think that, if you're thinking practically, that's the question you got to work on, because clearly, like blind just like my country, right or wrong, that's a terrible situation. but we are embedded in this society, and it does require a sort of bonds of fellow feeling.
Yes,
among the citizenry.
As Aristotle said, you need the bonds of affection and certain shared understandings of what social life should be. And socialism has a lot to offer in terms of framing what those affective ties should be, right? And how Americans should, and it's a tremendous view that incorporates what Omar was saying about how to be American is to treat all. See, the right tends to think of unity as something that eschews difference. And of course, fascism at its very core is all about annihilating difference. And that's why it's a will to nothingness and a will to death. But the type of affirming of unity in diversity, or the e pluribus unum notion, where Omar says that you speak your difference, but as an American, that is the type of lefty integration of difference into a certain type of unity and bond, where everyone considers themselves, right, brothers and sisters, or as we like to say, comrades. Not just despite those differences, but in part because those differences suggest we're all equally human, and we should therefore celebrate the different manifestations of our humanity and what they represent, but not in a way to just totally tie in some kind of like liberal dream of an untetheredness to any particularities of time, space, location, or otherwise, right? That would be almost like the joke of Stephen Colbert when he says, "I'm colorblind. I didn't realize you're black. I can't see color." Right? This notion, right? This thing was this papering over difference, as if, right, you can have this floating ego in the world, right? MacIntyre says here on page 16, right? Suppose the bonds of patriotism to be dissolved. Would liberal morality be able to provide anything adequately substantial in its place? What the morality of patriotism at its best provides is a clear account of and justification for the particular bonds and loyalties which form so much of the substance of moral life. It does so by underlying the moral importance of the different members of a group, acknowledging a shared history. Each one of us, to some degree or other, understands his or her life as an enacted narrative, and because of our relationships with others, we have to understand ourselves as characters in the enacted narratives of other people's lives. And so he goes on, right? And so there's something interesting about what's that narrative that Omar's speaking of? It's the narrative of a land built on all kinds of immigrants who come in at different times. And so the shared history is the shared history of integration, assimilation of immigrants to a country whose ideals were founded not on a certain ethnicity, right? Not actually on a particular religious or ethnic basis, but on ideals, and here's the seemingly contradictory part, that embrace the pluralistic affirmation of any particular type of person who wants to self-govern in a polity like this, right? And so the struggle of civil rights has been to actually, right, make politically real the ideal that all humans are created equal to rule. What that means is created equal in their capacity to rule themselves and each other collectively. That's the whole point. The move away from monarchy and from other forms of power, that's based on this notion that no one is superior to anyone else in their ability to flourish and to govern themselves or others collectively. And so that ideal has had to be struggled for to actually include people from all over the world of different religious and ethnic traditions. And that's a thing worth pursuing. It's a very lefty idea that comports with the Declaration of Independence. And so I don't know why we can't embrace that as a vision for what we should be fighting for. I think that's a type of patriotism that could be not this xenophobic, jingoistic, right-wing version, but neither this liberal notion that there's this dispassionate thing where you don't understand the value of community or affective ties, right?
Yeah. I mean, you see the danger of liberalism and the spread of neoliberalism, and how, you have all these national elites who have completely ditched any sort of loyalty to their own communities and view them just basically as places to be pillaged as mercilessly as they would pillage any global South country.
That's right. The Rust Belt and the Steel Belt got totally hosed for that very reason, right?
Yeah, so I was just putting this in an article the other day. Wholesalers put 780 million opioid pills into West Virginia over 6 years. One town of like 325 people got 9 million pills over just 2 years. And it's from that type of reasoning a curdled, I would say. It's not people thinking like I am, this is the moral type of thing, but just like I am not a part of this community. I'm just thinking abstractly about my own personal interests and so on. Clearly John Rawls would never do anything like that. But that is a danger, the people who just like they jack themselves out of their community and don't they pretend as though they don't depend on anybody else, as if like they're John Galt or whatever. And it can be, I think, in a toxic form, just incredibly poisonous.
Yeah, that's right.
Politically.
Yeah, to be fair to John Rawls, the veil of ignorance, right, and the thought experiment he came up with in Justice is Fairness is meant to actually come up with a theory for how to create a specific political community that is fair in that actual nation state, and that, right? So like there's,
yes.
And he would be basically, I think, a social democrat at the very least in terms of providing for fundamental European welfare states that we don't do in this country at all, and so on.
Oh God, what's his name? Charles Mills, a philosopher from Jamaica. He's got a great critique of Rawls in which he brings up this exact point to say that, yeah, you're thinking about this abstractly about how to create an ideal society, but then like, well, what about history? What about the particular injustices that particular groups have suffered over the time? And like, would those, he says, what if those situations are metaphysically distant from your sort of ideal like framework that you would set up in the context of just sort of like random people who are all exactly the same. And so you may need to introduce but he doesn't dismiss it. He said, introduce things to rescue this notion, which is very appealing, and I think it's got a lot to offer of the veil of ignorance, and the difference principle and whatnot. To say to push towards a more realistically grounded way of saying that yes, what we need is the type of thing you're gesturing towards, but we have to take history into account. And that's what I think, when if you sort of like try to zoom out or think a little more utopian about this, a good, a thing to kind of aim at maybe would be Star Trek, the Federation of Planets, right? So they posit a future history in which all the nations were sort of gradually dissolved into this overarching structure in which first all humans on planet Earth were sort of combined over the years into this one big thing to say that, we're not Americans anymore. We're just humans. We're citizens of planet Earth. And then later other species, the Vulcans and so on, they got absorbed in there. And it's not like the sort of history, not super familiar with the Star Trek canon, but the history was that it proceeded, in stages where you had the United States and you had, various other countries, but then they slowly came together in the kind of United Nations type of thing. And they, the bonds of patriotism, as we've been talking about, were just extended further and further and further until they encompassed everybody.
And I think a key part of that is there's no scarcity anymore, right? Technology has developed, so that's a huge part of it. And I'm not sure if the technology and the fact that they're moving through space means you also don't have like the spatial boundedness, right? Right? Like, obviously.
Well, you're bounded by politics because they get in fights with other people all the time. But yeah, right. I mean, that's a kind of, we have replicators now and fusion, and so we have no. In fact, I believe in the Star Wars history that sparks a giant war, the discovery of limitless energy, because like that just undermines the whole basis of politics. But at any rate, you could imagine a sort of like a future over the next like 100 years or so, which would sort of tend towards the ideal version of how the European Union has expanded. Like setting aside all of the terrible things about the European Union, just taking the best parts of it, free movement, and
of people, yeah,
free exchange of people and goods. You can go anywhere you want, and all that, and just that sort of thing. It's just gradually extended across the entire world, and taking your own rooted historical contingent understanding of your community and gradually building that out across the whole of society. And I think, that's a task of generations, but I think that's something that really, I think workers of the world unite. That was a really good slogan, that really bound a lot of people together.
Well, and that's what I think leftism, that hopefully even in the, putative democratic socialist, but actually maybe social democrat, to the extent that distinction matters, Bernie Sanders' campaign is recognizing the international solidarity and the need to inform policy, and also just in terms of rhetoric and solidarity, speak out for the workers of the world and the dispossessed around the world, the stateless, but also within certain bounded communities, those that are being oppressed by other governments, and to make that form of alliance across the globe, not based on kind of this realist notion of like, which allies can help us get more oil, and like which resources, who should we try to help dominate the world together with, and and the shift, like that is a totally different way to look at it, where we could have a leftist internationalism that still cares about flourishing in the particular communities you live in, right? And you care very much about, as many lefties I know have said, like, lots of right-wingers like, well, why don't you critique the governments around the world for what they're doing? It's like, well, I do, but guess what? This is the one I live in that I am responsible to, and I'm literally able to influence the elections and the other forms of politics here. So I have the duty and the responsibility and the care for this community as a primary community to care for and to be active in as a citizen, right? And that doesn't go against caring about other communities. That's the whole point, right? It's unity and diversity in a different scale.
Yeah, and it's apparently, around the world, people are looking at Bernie. A lot of lefties around the world are looking at Bernie and just like crossing their fingers. The Corbynites in the UK, what's his name in Bolivia, Evo Morales. They're looking at that and they're just like, oh, freaking hope that Bernie wins. And that's that's the kind of thing to it's is if you flip American imperialism on its head. I mean, America, at least for the moment, is the keystone of the whole global capitalist empire thing. And if you could really take that down, or operate it on behalf, maybe you couldn't completely dismantle it overnight or transform it overnight, but the president has a ton of power over this kind of stuff, and he could really change the way that global politics operates.
Or she, Elizabeth Warren, possibly.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think she's quite as good as on foreign policy, but shit, a hell of a lot better than Trump, that's for sure. And to say in at least, maybe somewhat limited extent, depending on how able he is to manage the bureaucracy and so on, and what types of people he puts into place, like, you could absolutely transform the politics of like hundreds of nations overnight, just to be like, oh yeah, we elect this person and we're not going to face a sort of capital strike, or we could sort of call on our friends to like bust down the tax havens. Like, Bermuda or Ireland or Switzerland. Like, think of the power you could turn on those places and be like, stop hiding all the money from rich people around the world.
Right.
And like, they need to pay what they owe.
And man, if you can get a leftism that actually really does that, I think people will be shocked how many. I mean, there was this town hall that Bernie did with Fox News, right? And he did Fox Town Hall.
Yes.
And the audience went nuts for Medicare. For all the audience, apparently, I don't know how they selected the audience, but apparently they went nuts for all kinds of things that the gotcha Fox, moderator was trying to get him on. And he just spoke like proudly of his positions, and the crowd went nuts. Like, I think you could really, people misunderstand, one, how fixed people's ideologies are, two, how well they understand ideologies. I mean, we all remember "get your government hands off my Medicare" signs, right?
Yep.
And three, if these narratives that people have currently can be shaped differently so people understand their shared history in a new way, I mean, no one's going to peg Bernie as an anti-patriot, or those that do. It's not going to work. If he can actually show that he's fighting the system that is harming everyone, right? I think there's a lot of possibility about how people rethink this country, how they rethink immigrants, how they rethink people around the world. There's a lot of possibility out there, right? And there's no reason not to fight for that vision of what could be.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how they picked that audience, maybe the Sanders campaign puts like half of them in there or something, but I don't think you'd get the majority of Trump supporters to jump, to be on the Medicare for All bandwagon, but you would get some, I think, and if you could actually do it, I think that, you would create as like in West Virginia, people used to put up portraits of Franklin Roosevelt on their like mantelpiece, as a symbol of a kind of, it's like you could say it's like a personal symbol, but I'd say it's also a sort of patriotic symbol. It's like, here's a leader who cares about what I'm doing, and this is why the United States is good.
That's right. Because
the leader cares about me, cares about my problems, and is going to try to make things better for me.
Yes. And
that kind of politics has been almost totally absent in the United States for a long time. It's just it's neoliberal sort of cosmopolitan, substance-free identity politics on the one side, and just revanchist culture war bigotry on the other side. And, we just haven't seen how that kind of thing could play out. But I think that you could peel off a substantial portion of the Trumpan proletariat, as you might call it, and perhaps more importantly, activate a lot of people who have just totally given up on the system. Be like, here's a guy he's not bullshitting us. He's not the same old stuff. Or she, I think Warren could accomplish much the same thing. And so harnessing that type of the social bonds we were talking about before to build an American identity which isn't just violent and hateful, right, and just wanting to stomp on other people.
There's a reason why the right wing gets a lot of play out of calling leftists anti-American, and there's some truth to it, right? Like so they try to just make the troops. Well, there's a fucking reason that they keep mentioning the troops, and MacIntyre talks about soldiers. What are soldiers supposed to do? So soldiers are supposed to protect by force the total dissolution of your community. And to do that, they can't be questioning whether or not any particular policy or thing that you're doing is wrong, because to do that would be to neglect that fundamental last-ditch responsibility they have to save the Union from just totally being eradicated, right? And that's an important role, but we haven't needed that role in like forever. And instead, we've used not as a defensive tool, but the army as an aggressive form of imperialism and militarism in order to dominate the rest of the world. But like theoretically, soldiers are supposed to really represent that friend-enemy distinction, which means we care about our community against aggressors and we want to protect it. So like acknowledge that that's an ideal worth having while still fighting to make the country that you want to exist, that's what it means, that it should exist, to be the best version of itself it can be, right? And that might mean totally tearing up the Constitution. That might mean, who knows, open borders. Who knows, right? But like, you're just masturbating if you're trying to avoid the fact that all good has to occur in a time and space with people that live here. And so there needs to be an understanding of that if we want to build a future where we can build those kind of coalitions and bring people into the fold for a leftist vision.
Yeah. Maybe as a closing comment, Kurt Vonnegut once said about George Bush and soldiers during the post 9/11 era, he said that I may be misremembering the quote exactly, but he said that he's treating them like I was never treated, like toys a rich kid got for Christmas. And that's the flip side of this sort of conservative of valorization of the military, is that they, Jesus, you like the fighter jets and the fucking troops at the football games and so on. The flip side of that is going over to fight wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and like 150 countries for special forces to do fuck all. That's right. To do nothing, go get blown up for no reason whatsoever.
That's right. And and if they survive all of that, they end up killing themselves in great number, right? And as Judith Butler writes about, the quote indispensable people, which means our military, they're indispensable, are actually the most disposable or dispensable people. We just throw their bodies away in all these unnecessary wars, and we don't give them medical care that's proper. We don't give them the vests they even need while they're over there. We don't give them the mental health treatment that they deserve when they get back. And so this perversion that we hinted at the beginning, where it's a fake patriotism, it's a bullshit, cynical power grab by oligarchs who don't give a shit about the populations they're going to war with. They don't give a shit about the people here that are suffering, migrant or white collar or blue collar workers. They appropriate these terms in cynical ways, and actually they don't give a shit about our military. They only care about using these terms and these people to their selfish ends at the expense of blood and treasure.
Yeah. I was reading the Brown University cost of war thing is something like 6,500 soldiers dead in post 9/11 wars and like 900,000, over 900,000 suffering either physical or mental problems, injuries afterwards. You know, this is not a small number of people. And so, anyways, I'm not sure how or if Bernie could sort of tie that kind of a critique into any sort of like, lasting political message. But it's definitely true, that this, the soldiers have been treated, the military has been treated with nearly the same, somewhat lesser, I suppose, in terms of medical care and stuff, but the same contempt for life as the Iraqi civilians. Yeah. You're not bombing the military bases, but George Bush didn't give a fuck about any of the dead soldiers. He didn't give a fuck. He wouldn't even let the cameras show the coffins coming home, It was like a purely political instrument for him. Right. And so, you could possibly imagine a future in which the patriotic energies, the inherent need of American society to provide some sort of a glue to hold it together as a functioning organism could be directed in a much more healthy and much less destructive fashion, where it's not just being turned loose on random countries in the Middle East, and instead it's about fixing the problems at home and trying to allow the rest of the world to climb up the prosperity ladder in a environmentally sustainable fashion.
Yeah.
And that's what we got to do.
That's right. And it's a lot easier in a way than it might have been had Trump actually done the $1 trillion infrastructure thing we thought he was going to do at the beginning, right? Like, had he actually helped his own supporters, had he actually even cared about just white people, right? Did you see that Chris Hayes podcast with the guy on white people and they're dying, right? And so just like, even forget all the people around the world that we're harming with our policies, but even our own communities, even those that vote for Trump are being harmed. And so that should be, right, something we can fight with a positive vision. So I hope so.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. Well, thanks for listening, folks. Thanks, patrons, for subscribing. And we appreciate your support very much.
Yeah, you're the best.
And we will see you in the next episode.
See you. Bye-bye.